here. Now, I got a very good question from one of you, and they were asking me, what has this renin-angiotensin system got to do with the respiratory system? Why do we need to learn it? Now, if you recall, when we were discussing homeostasis and we looked at the electrolytes and electrolyte balance, we said one of the electrolytes that you really need to closely regulate is sodium and potassium. And for the sodium-potassium balance, you cannot discuss it without discussing this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is the RAAS system. If you recall, this was supposed to be a revision because what people tend to do is to memorize. You memorize the flow. So from A, you go to this, you go to this, and you can actually write for me a whole essay. But if I ask you, what is ACE? You can't even tell what it is or where it is found. So what I wanted you to do is to see that in the course of forming the active hormone, angiotensin 2, you start with angiotensinogen, which is a protein coming from the liver. This is converted to angiotensin 1, and you need renin from the kidney to do that. So the whole story starts with at the kidney. What is happening at the kidney? So when the kidney detects there's something wrong, it releases renin. Renin will go into the blood system and find a protein that was produced by the liver, already circulating in blood, but it is in the form of angiotensinogen. So if you remember, we said that some of these enzymes are secreted as pre or pro-enzyme hormone or inactive proteins. So angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 1. But again, this one is still running in circulation in the blood. So it is still not active. It cannot do anything. However, once it goes to the lungs, there is a special enzyme. This is the angiotensin converting enzyme. This is very abundant in the endothelial cells of the pulmonary vessels and the renal vessels. So once you get there, the blood that is passing there will have the angiotensin 1 converted to angiotensin 2 by this enzyme, very abundant in the lungs. Angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, once it is converted to angiotensin 2, now you have an active hormone. This active hormone will go and bind to cells within the blood vessels, within the kidney tubules and all that, so that it corrects what was wrong. So initially you had a problem either with the low amounts of sodium or with the blood pressure, it was too low or something. So now you're going to initiate steps to happen to correct that. So the purpose of bringing in was to show you, if you remember, one of the functions of the lungs is synthesis in the lungs is for enzymes. And ACE is one of the enzymes. So if I tell you blindly that synthesis of angiotensin converting enzyme, you find that you just memorize it without knowing the role that enzyme plays. That's why I told you go back to that slide and figure out what it does. So again, I'll tell you to just look at it. It helps you in understanding blood pressure regulation. It helps you in understanding electrolyte balance. And now you can see it also helps you with the lung function. So other things that are secreted or synthesized within the lungs. So apart from the enzymes, one of which we have just discussed, we also have things like immunoglobulins, which play a role in the immune system. We also have other proteins such as elastin, collagen, fibrinogen. All these are connective tissue proteins. And they have different functions. so that if you have a lot of elastin, this lung becomes too compliant, but then it is not strong enough. Strength is given by things like the fibrin, which is converted from fibrinogen. So we also have another structural protein, the collagen. So they will give strength. This one will give elasticity. As you know, in the lung, we need that lung to be elastic. If there is any damage to the tissue, we need a lot of synthesis of these proteins so that you can actually do the lung repair. So apart from the enzymes, you also have now the structural proteins. You also have immunoglobulins because you need to keep the lung also protected. In addition, we said surfactant is of utmost importance. We'll see the role of surfactant when it comes to giving compliance, extensibility, or elasticity to the lung, so that no amounts of surfactant. By the way, the surfactant acts like detergents. If you recall, when we talked about surfactant also acts like a detergent. It will change the property of the surface. So we are going to look at that as a topic on its own. The other component that it is good in secreting are the lipids. So these are just some of the things that you need to understand that are secreted within the lungs. Now, when it comes to the structural components of the respiratory system, the first thing I mentioned is that it is divided into two portions. You have the upper respiratory tract, and then we have the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract focuses mainly on protection and priming the air, because as the air comes in, we said it needs to be prepared so that by the time it goes to the lungs, it is already clean and warm and moist, and it is free of any microbes. So what does that? The upper respiratory tract will have all those components that we said are important for priming. Number two, the second portion is made up now of the lower respiratory tract, which comprises from the trachea, we have the voice box, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchial tree. And by the way, it is called a bronchial tree because if you look at it, it looks like actually a tree that is upside down with the main stem and two main branches. And then from there, you find that it starts to have very, very many sub branches. So this one is actually like a tree with its canopy, but upside down. So this is referred to as the branchial tree. So all these, together with the lung tissue, which is made up of the bronchial tree and the alveoli, now this part will comprise of two portions also. It has what we call the conducting portion. That means conducting acts like a conduit. A conduit is a passage. A conduit is a passage. So we have that portion of the lower respiratory tract whose main work is just to act as a passage, and therefore it conducts air. It allows air to pass through. In this portion, there is no gaseous exchange that takes place. The best thing that can happen is the second part of the priming, whereby we have mucus layer and cilia on the epithelial lining, so that the cilia is always pushing the mucus upwards. So apart from allowing the air to pass through, it is also doing some other fine cleaning of the air. Then the second portion is the exchange. portion. This is in the terminal region where we have the alveoli bulging. So this is where now the gases exchange between the external environment and the blood capillaries, which represent the internal environment. So you either have the conducting portion or the exchange portion. Apart from those structures that I have mentioned, which clearly define the path which the air takes place. So the air will come from outside and it will pass through these airways and all the way to the exchange portion. So apart from this passage to the exchange portion, there are other components which act like accessory organs. Remember, when we are talking of any biological system, we talk of the main tract that is involved in the process. And then we have the additional structures which facilitate the process to take place. Those additional structures are the accessory organs. So now, what I have discussed with you, the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract, that is the main structure of the respiratory system. However, on its own, it cannot carry out the process of respiration. For that reason, it needs, in addition to what you have discussed, it needs other structures that will allow air movement. And those other structures include the ribs, and it will also include the muscles. So we have the ribs coming on top here, and we have the muscles in between the ribs, and of course, the muscles that make up the diaphragm. So these muscles act as the accessory structures which are required to allow ventilation to occur. And if you recall, ventilation is the free movement of air in and out. It will not occur if you don't have these two components. So I have here what I have already said. You have the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract, and then you have all these structures. And this diagram is giving you a representation of the same, having the upper and the lower, and then you have the main structures of gaseous exchange. But in addition, we also have the accessory parts. So now I have these two diagrams side by side. The one giving the main respiratory structures on your left, and then we have the accessory structures on the right. So although you have the diaphragm here, this is also a part of the component here. It's supposed to be at the base forming an arc. So let us look at the musculature and the skeletal structures. So we have the ribs which form a cage. They sort of form a protective cabin around the lungs. So the lungs will be situated right in there. And if you recall, the lung is a very soft tissue, which is prone to damage. It can easily be damaged. And therefore, by putting it right in between that space of the thoracic region, protected by the ribs, it actually gives additional protection or mechanical protection from any damage. So apart from that, the ribs are also involved in the contraction process. And for contraction to occur, you need the musculature. So which muscles do we have? We have quite a number of muscles that are performing both in quiet breathing and secondly, in forceful breathing. So let us focus first on quiet breathing. Quiet breathing will involve the muscles that stay in between the ribs. These are the external intercostal muscles. These external intercostal muscles, they are located to the outside of the ribs. The ribs are arranged in a, I would say, like a cone shape. So to the outside, if you contract, what will happen? It will tend to raise. It will tend to raise this rib cage upwards. That chamber that is formed by the ribs is known as the rib cage. And the rib cage, once the outside muscles contract, it will be raised outwards. And if it is raised outwards, it will occupy a bigger space and a higher space. So it is bigger in that if you look at the size, it's going outwards. And secondly, it's coming from the flattened region and coming to a higher place here. So the ribcage shape will be different when you inflate it or when you contract those muscles. So when you contract the muscles, the other muscle that is usually contracted is the diaphragm. And actually the diaphragm is the one that contributes the highest percentage in the contraction process. So if you look at the shape of the diaphragm, it has some circular muscles. And then it will have those longitudinal muscles around them. So when they contract, what happens is that this region that was very relaxed tends to come closer to each other. And when they do that, it means that the diaphragm will change its shape and become more flat. So when it becomes more flat, it means it is changing from this arc position and going downwards, increasing this room. And this one is increasing the size. So what will happen in total is that the rib cage volume will drastically change. When that happens, the next thing you know is that now, because as the ribs change, they pull the lungs out. And as they pull the lungs outwards, they increase the lung volume. And by increasing the lung volume, they change the air pressure inside. It becomes less, forcing the air to come in from outside, either through the nostrils or through the mouth to fill up that gap. So we totally need these intercostal muscles, external intercostal, and the diaphragm for quiet breathing. Those two, one, and these for quiet breathing. Now, when you come to exhale, after you have raised the rib cage and you want to exhale, all you have to do is to relax these muscles. And once you relax them, they go back to their original position, crashing on the lungs. And what will happen is once they crash on the lungs, they create a very high pressure here, which will be much higher than outside, forcing the air to move out. So you have essentially described inhalation and exhalation during quiet breathing. And that quiet breathing is rhythmic. So at the end of exhalation, the muscles contract again and you inhale. At the end of inhalation, the muscles relax again and you exhale. So the air will be coming in and out, in and out at a consistent volume, a consistent rate. And that we call the tidal breathing or tidal volume, which you are going to encounter when you're doing your practical. So after the quiet breathing, now we have to bring in the forceful breathing. So we'll start again with muscles involved with forceful inhalation. Inhalation. Do I need to decrease or increase the thoracic chamber? What do I need to do so that I can inhale?
Increase the volume.
So we need to increase the volume. So the muscles we first described here have increased the volume to a given extent, but you want to increase it much further than that. So the only muscles that can participate in that is by pulling the sternum outwards. This is the sternum. You have to raise it up so that the chest comes forward. How do you do that? You use these sternocleidomastoid muscles. You can see they are attached to the bones of the sternum. So once these ones contract, they are going to raise the sternum. Secondly, we have the scalens, which are attached to the first and second rib, and they'll also pull these ribs much further. So if we have the sternum and we have these ribs raising the whole rib cage even further, it means you increase the chamber here much further than you had done before. So these muscles are involved in forceful inhalation. Okay? Forceful inhalation. These are involved in quiet inhalation. Now, after you do that, you want to exhale. So the first thing that happens is you have to relax all these muscles. So relax those two muscles, relax this, and what will happen is the whole rib cage will collapse on the lungs. And when that happens, takes a very short time, and you find it takes out the highest percentage of air from your lungs. By collapsing and crushing the lungs, it's like you have a balloon and you just squeeze the balloon out and it forces everything out. Now, after that happens, you want to continue crushing the lung further. So what do we do? You're going to use your abdominal muscles, contract the abdominal muscles so that they can actually pull the rib cage lower. And as you pull it lower, you are forcing the chamber to become smaller. Number two, you also want to use the internal intercostal muscles, which are located to the inside of the ribs. So we are going to see the structure of the rib later so that you can see if you have a cross section of a rib here, you will have the external intercostal muscles on this side. So let's say this is another rib. So you have the external intercostal located here, and you will have the internal intercostals located on this side. So when the external intercostal are contracted, they raise the rib outwards. Okay, so if these ones contract, they raise the rib outward like that, because remember there's another rib here, and even this one contracts on the outside. So this side will become smaller, causing the ribs to move outwards. Now, the opposite is happening when you are contracting the internal intercostal. It means you are pulling the ribs closer to each other. When you contract the internal intercostals, you bring them. So for forceful inhalation, exhalation, you need the internal intercostal, and then you also need the abdominal muscles. Are we clear on that?
Yes.
Any question? Okay, so these are the muscles that are required for ventilation. I think I can move on to the next one. Oh, I should have actually just used this diagram. You can see what I was telling you. We have the internal intercostals, we have those that are in between, and then we have the innermost. but both of them contract during forceful breathing or forceful exhalation. The external ones will contract during forceful inhalation. Sorry, external intercostal muscles are the ones which usually contract just during quiet breathing. I think I have already discussed a lot on this slide, but I had brought it up so that you can see the relationship between the ribs and the muscles. Now, there is another component I have not discussed, and that one is of the pleural membranes. Now, if we look at this diagram of the lungs, which is superimposed on where the ribs and the muscles are. If I were to just cut a section, a cross section here, just beneath your the armpits, if you just cut just beneath the armpit, you find that you just be above the heart. And then you look at it from the surface. So your eye will be located. You cut off this part, remove the upper part, and your eye is looking downwards like that. So you are looking at the cut surface. This is what you're going to see. At the back, you have the vertebral column. At the front, you have the sternum. And this is the heart surface. So now what you're going to see on the you have on the right side a part of the lung, on the left side a part of the lung. What I wanted to show here is that you have this space between the lung and the body wall, and that is the pleural cavity. Now, on this other side, we have also another pleural cavity. And if you look at this pleural cavity, is independent of this one. So this one is airtight on its own. This one is airtight on its own. But in addition, we have the pericardial cavity, which surrounds the heart. Okay, so we have quite a number of cavities, and they bear a lot of physiological significance, especially when it comes to breathing. We will refer more to the pleural cavity rather than the pericardium. So now, if you understand that these two are very separate, it means that this lung can work independently of this one, and you see how. Yeah. So I want you to use a bit of your imagination. Now imagine if you had a balloon or a tennis ball or something, and you have a handle here attached to this balloon. So you have a sphere, the balloon. What I want you to do is to coat the whole of this balloon with super glue. Okay? Then you take another balloon, but you don't fill the second balloon with air or water. I just want you to put a very small amount of water so that this wall of the second balloon can come very close to this other balloon. And make sure that this second balloon can wrap totally around this blue balloon. So remember, you have super glue here. So when you sort of wrap it around, this wall will be totally stuck to the blue wall. The inner side of the balloon is totally stuck to the blue one. Now, it means if you are to do any activity to the blue balloon, because of this attachment, it is also going to affect the red balloon. Okay. With this in mind, you find that if I were to take the outermost wall of the red balloon and pull it apart. And remember, there is no air coming in here. There is no, this one is airtight actually. The second balloon is airtight. So if I pull the outside wall to the outside, what I'm going to do, what will happen to the cavity inside here? I want somebody to tell me. If you are following what I said, and this is when I start asking people and then they tell me, repeat the question because they never heard what I was talking about. So please let me know that you are following. My question is, in this balloon, and I'll call somebody randomly, so you better follow the question. If I pull the outer wall of the red balloon, what will happen inside the space between the two walls of the red balloon? Who can volunteer before I start calling people randomly? Yes, Patience. Unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm saying what I see is when you put this red balloon, you are increasing the volume there in between, and hence the pressure is decreasing.
Okay, let's hear what Asna has to say.
I think it will create a vacuum.
It will. So both of them are correct. Please, if you are not listening, you've been given the two answers. One of the things will happen is that once you are doing that, you are increasing the volume inside there. And because this part is airtight, nothing is going in or out, what you're doing is actually creating a partial vacuum. Okay? So now you have increased the volume, you have created a partial vacuum because the pressure here becomes very low. So now, if, let's say this, you can see what has happened here. The inner balloon is continuous with the outwards. So what is likely to happen? You have created a partial vacuum and you are still pulling it out. What will happen? What do you think will be the next step?
The blue balloon.
Anastasia. Yes, Anastasia?
Yeah, I'm saying the blue balloon will occupy that space that has been created when the red balloon moves outwards.
So actually the blue balloon, because remember these two walls are stuck. These two walls are stuck to each other. But now you have opened this balloon here. So it is continuous with the air outside. So what will happen is as you pull it out, you will force even the inner balloon, the inner wall of the red balloon to also move in that direction to try and get rid of the vacuum. And because they are stuck to the blue balloon, it will also pull out the blue balloon. So this is exactly what happens. This is exactly what happens in this setup. You can see the lungs here and the pleural membrane, the inner pleural membrane are stuck to each other. So if I were to use the correct histological terminology, this pleural membrane is towards the viscera. So it is the visceral pleural membrane. Then this is towards the body wall. So this is the parietal pleural membrane. So we have the parietal and then we have the visceral. And between the two membranes, we have a very, very tiny gap, which is occupied by fluid, a very thin amount of fluid. So what happens is when you raise the rib cage outwards, you're going to create a partial vacuum here. And this partial vacuum will force the visceral pleural to also move in that direction. And what will happen? Remember that the lungs are very spongy and elastic. So when the visceral pleura pulls it outwards, they will also be pulled away from each other. So these are just small spaces, which are the alveoli. So what will happen is when you pull out the lungs in all directions, the alveoli becomes bigger. When the alveoli becomes bigger, it means the volume inside the lung is much bigger and it will force the air to move inside. For that reason, this pleural membrane and the pleural cavity and the pressure within that place is of utmost importance so that it allows expansion of the lung. If we remove that pressure here, the lung cannot expand. So we definitely need that place to be partially have a partial vacuum so that it allows the lungs to stay attached or pulled outwards so that even the lungs itself, the alveoli stay open. If you are to rip, if, let's say you are to come and puncture that position, create a hole between the external environment and the pleural cavity, air, because remember this place has a very low pressure, what will happen is air will rush into that space. And once the air rushes into that space, it will create a high pressure region, and this high pressure region will push against the lung. And once it pushes against the lungs will occupy a very tiny space. So let me draw the final structure of the lung if you have punctured this part. So air from the atmosphere will gush in. It will create a high pressure region which will squeeze on the lung, and the lung will fall and it will collapse. This is what we call a lung collapse, or in physiological terminology, we call it a pneumothorax, where the lung has collapsed. So in order to prevent the lung collapse, you must have a partial vacuum, and the partial vacuum is facilitated by these two pleural membranes. Are we together so far?
Yes.
So there are some people who get lost, and when they hear the others have said they are okay, they just say, okay, I'll move on with the class. Please, do you have a question so far? Anybody? Yes, Patience?
Yeah. I just want to know if okay, that lung collapse, like last night my friend had chest pain. I'm like she was breathing in and out and she could feel the pain. So
Who's
me
that?
in my mind I was
Sorry?
like, it's a friend.
Okay.
It's a friend of mine. So she was breathing in and out and she could feel the pain. Is it related to this? And I'm wondering, can lung collapse at its own for some hours, because it rested for 3 hours?
Okay, chest pain can be due to several things. And you find that even when you have a problem with the muscles, because they send signals to the pain receptors. And because of that, every time you're trying to contract the muscles, you feel pain. So it could be related to something else, not really the lung collapse. The reason I'm saying this is when you have a lung collapse, you can't breathe. You cannot. Because for the breathing mechanism to occur, you must have an intact chamber which will pull out the lung outwards. But when the lung collapses, it cannot be pulled out. So what you start feeling is suffocation. Is you want to breathe, but you cannot. You feel you are sending the signal to your chest, but nothing is getting into the chest. So you actually suffocate, although you are in a position to be able to breathe, but you suffocate because no air that can go in. So the other thing is, you said, can it happen temporarily? Usually not, unless it depends on what is the cause of the collapse. You can have some partial collapse, which means in this lung, and Ivy, I saw your hand up, so as soon as I'm done this, if I forget who it was, Ivy, you still keep your question intact. You may have an issue in this particular part, so that maybe this part of the lung has ruptured and some of the alveolar air is able to come and fill in this space. What will happen is that alveolar air will come and push against the lung downwards, and you can have just a collapse of that region. You can also have a collapse of another part, probably maybe due to some infection. So when they are added up, you find that you're not getting the maximum amount of air, because the part where there is a collapse, it cannot extend. So imagine this part has collapsed, that it has sunk in. So when you try to expand the lungs, this part will expand, this part will expand, but this part will not. If there is another space, again, even that one will not. If there is so you find every part where you have some partial collapse, it cannot extend. It means at the end of your inhalation, you do not have maximum amount of air like you want to. So you are not getting the full percentage of air that you are supposed to be getting. So we could have some other causes of collapse, but I think in your case, it was not related to that, but unless you get the medical diagnosis, you cannot say by just the information is given. So Ivy, what was your question?
Madam, I wanted clarification about the explanation on the lung collapse, but as you explained that, I understood. Thank you.
All right, all right. Okay, so there is no other question, so that I can move to the next one. So on this part, there is usually, Axilla, I'll come to you. There is usually a question that people are often given. If you find your friend, they were in an altercation whereby the friend has been stabbed, and you find a knife sticking out of the chest, what are you supposed to do? What is the immediate thing that you're supposed to do? You find your friend, he has just or she has just been stabbed, but there is a knife sticking out of the chest. What do you do? You are so scared to even think about it. Anybody?
You leave it in.
Thank you. From the explanation I have just given you, you leave it where it is. You leave that knife there, because the minute you pull it out, air will pass through that hole. And the next thing is you'll have a lung collapse. When the person has a lung collapse, they can't breathe. As long as the knife is still stuck there, it holds onto the walls of the chest, and therefore it makes it airtight. So the person is still able to breathe. They may have some bleeding, But the one thing you need is oxygen to continuously go into their body. The minute you put it out, oxygen stops to go in. So the person dies. So you are advised in such an incident, let the person be taken to hospital, because when they go to hospital, they have to go through the surgical removal of that object. How do they do that? They can hold the person. They can hold the person with a ventilator so that they still continue giving them oxygen while they are working on this part. But anyway, now that is going beyond our class. Let's hear Axilla followed by Sebata.
The question I had when you talked about lung collapse, let's say in the case of a person who is suffering from tuberculosis, is it also
Pardon?
because of a person who suffers from tuberculosis?
Yeah, what about you?
Yeah, like they said their lungs are filled with water. Like, how is it related to lung collapse?
No, that one is not related, but I'll come to that. Let's see as a better. So the other terminology, pneumo is related to the lung, and the term that you use is pneumothorax. Sebata?
So I'm assuming that lungs are not similar to kidneys in such a way that if you lose one, the other also functions. So
I can't hear you. You have a lot of echo.
Alright, I'm saying that I'm assuming that lungs don't necessarily function like kidneys, that if you lose one in kidneys, the other can still support the body. So with lungs, like both of them always have to work.
That's a very nice question. There are those people who thought that the minute you have a lung collapse, you cannot meet the needs of oxygen in your body. So definitely with one lung you die. But recently, there are some people who have actually had undergone some surgical procedures where one lung is totally absent and they have survived with one lung. So that is something that has cropped up. There are ways that you can survive with one lung. But before, it used to be said the minute you have one lung collapse, you are a dead person. Yeah. So I don't know. That is more recent. I cannot comment beyond that. So Axilla is asking about fluid in the lungs. Now I want you to remember what I have given you here. The drawings that I have given you here, this second balloon is representing the whole of the pleural cavity. It is not representing an individual alveolus. Now, if you look at this diagram here, you can see that each lung, okay, this is the whole of the pleural cavity, but each lung has individual alveoli. This one, all these small alveolus, all of them. Okay, so if I were to draw a sketch and say that this is one alveolus, this is another alveolus, this is another alveolus. So we have all these grape-like structures like that. And again, another one, and they are interdigiting with all of them so that if I were to draw, let's say another alveolus here, and another one here, so that they are all occupying all these spaces. Now, in between the alveoli, we have some wall, and it is at this region that we usually have blood vessels. Let's say the greens are the blood vessels, we have tissues, we have cells, okay, in between these spaces. And then we have the ECF. Now, the ECF is supposed to stay within the lung tissue. Remember, this is external environment. The ECF is supposed to stay here. However, in case of some infection, at times you may end up having a lot of fluid buildup inside the alveoli. So when you start having fluid coming in here, it starts to minimize the surface of exchange, so that this area was supposed to exchange gases, but now you have a thin layer of fluid and another one here. And by the time you start having fluid buildup, and at times even mucus, because if it is an infection, like in case of you're talking of tuberculosis, you can have a bacterial infection, you are going to have mucus production. So you have fluid and mucus. What you're doing is minimizing the area of gaseous exchange, and this is what you call pneumonia. So by the time you reach that, and you hear people with TB, they usually end up with pneumonia. And when they have pneumonia, if it is not treated, they die. So what I'm trying to tell you is, when you talk of fluid buildup, you could have the fluid building up within the alveolus. At times, you can also have fluid buildup within this pleural cavity. And when the fluid builds up within the fluid cavity, it means that even that component of partial pressure is reduced. So the extensibility of the lung is also reduced. So even that one, you do not want it. I told you about the pericardial cavity because another component that you usually find is fluid in this pericardial cavity. And now this one will start affecting the heart. So I think that captures your question, Maxilla. So we have talked about bones, muscles, and membranes. What do they do? The bones, they provide an attachment for the muscles, okay? We have the ribs, and then we have the vertebral column, and we have the sternum. All those provide attachment for the muscles. What do the muscles do? We need the muscles to contract and expand the rib cage. Whether it is the diaphragm, because we have the diaphragm on the lower portion, or whether it is the intercostal muscle, we need them to hold on to the skeletal structure, so that when they contract, they pull the whole chamber outwards. And therefore, we need that absolutely for the process of a respiration to occur. As for the membranes, I have just described to you the roles of the pleural membrane. They create a pressure inside the pleural cavity. If you do not have that pressure within the pleural cavity, then the lungs will collapse and they cannot extend outwards, and therefore you cannot breathe. The other component, apart from expansion, is you also need the recoil. Recoil occurs in two aspects. We have the recoil of the chest, okay, without touching the lungs. So when you contract the muscles and the chest goes outwards, if you relax the muscles, there is the tendency of the chest to just going back to where it was, and that is the chest recoil. On the other hand, we also have the recoil of the lungs. So after the lungs expand and then you release them, they also have a tendency to try and collapse to the lowest possible space. That is the lung recoil. The question is, even after the lungs recoil, you find that they still occupy a big space, okay? Actually, I shouldn't be drawing this. Let me clear. Let's look at this chest here. After it has expanded, it is occupying this space. But after it collapses, it goes back to this space. How come the lung does not occupy the smallest space possible? The reason is because the airways have to be kept open, and they are kept open by that partial pressure within the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity will pull the lung that way so that it stays open at all times. It does not collapse even at the end of exhalation. If this pressure within the pleural cavity was absent, it means the lung will recoil and you cannot see any space within the alveoli because the alveoli are kept open by that pressure. So I think just to read the last part, we say expansion and recoil of the lung and therefore of the alveoli occurs with the movement of the overlaying structure. So for whatever is happening inside the lung is dependent on the structures that are outside. All the structures have to be intact for you to be able to allow them to work the way they should. So I think I'm explaining ahead of my slides because I have just told you that there must be a cohesion. Cohesion is that tight attachment between the parietal and the pleural, the parietal and the visceral layers of the pleural membrane. The two of them must be stuck to each other for the breathing process to occur. So how do you facilitate that? Now, I always give an example of a stack of slides. If you have so many slides and they are stuck to each other like that, like when you go to the lab and you want to pick the first slide, you usually pull the first slide and then you lift it up and you find you can easily take that slide away. If you want to take the next one, again, you pull it slightly away from the others, creating some airspace, and you lift it up very easily. I want to ask you a question. Imagine somehow you put some drops of water and this water slid between the slides, and you have a very thin layer of water stuck between each of the slides. What happens to separating those slides? Does it become easier or more difficult?
More difficult.
How many people agree with her? More difficult or easier? More difficult. Let me see the more difficult. So to save time, I will assume everyone agrees with her. You are trying to separate, but because of that thin layer, and it doesn't have to be a lot, just a very thin layer of water will make all these slides stick to one another. And they have a very tight relationship, so that even if you try to remove this, it becomes very, very difficult. So this is the same concept. Between the two layers, there is a very thin film of water, or fluid, sorry. This is the pleural fluid. Now you can imagine how big the lungs are, but if you were to squeeze out all that fluid, it will not be more than 30 ml. 30 ml does not even reach 100. It doesn't even reach 50 ml. It's a very, very thin layer. For that reason, because of that thin fluid, it keeps these two membranes stuck to one another. So every time you try to pull the parietal membrane, because they are so stuck to each other, it pulls the visceral membrane. And remember that visceral membrane is attached to the lung, so even the visceral membrane pulls out the lung. The minute you puncture and you allow some air to go in, it will go in between those layers of molecules of water, and therefore it separates the two layers from each other. And once it separates the two layers, it means now you have some air here, and the recoil of the lung will be more forceful than the pressure pulling it outwards, making that lung collapse. The other thing is, similarly to the stack of slides, the slides I told you about, as long as the layer of water between the slides is very tiny, then the slides are stuck to each other. However, if you are to submit that, you easily lift off the slides from each other. Why? Because now you have more layers of water between the slides. In the same manner, if you are to add more fluid here, it means that you reduce the attraction between the two membranes. That cohesion is diminished. So you do not want a lot of fluid. For that reason, these pleural membranes are always continuously sucking out fluid from the cavity. And as they are doing that, they are creating a partial pressure, which is negative inside there. So I think this slide, I have covered it extensively. I have talked about the upper part of the respiratory tract, its main function being priming the air, one, to warm it so that it raises to the body temperature. Number two, humidifying the air so that whatever is coming in is usually very dry. It is the humidity of the atmospheric air. But then if you expose that atmospheric air to the surface, to the internal surface of the exchange surface or the conducting surface, they'll dry out. Whenever you have a dry surface, you cannot have gaseous exchange. So you need that humidity to be raised to the humidity inside the body. You need to filter. Filter comes from the gross or the coarse filtering, we're using the nasal hairs, or the fine one, using the mucus and the cilia. Then we also have the component of vocalizing, and this is facilitated by the voice box. Now, the voice box, as you can see, is an intricate structure, but we will not go to that. All I need to remind you is that we have some membranes through which they create a space, and as the air is moving through this narrow space, depending on the extent of the narrowing, it could be wide open, or it could be slightly slit, or it could be circularly open, depending on the shape, the tightness of the cartilage and the muscles. It will cause a certain vibration, creating some sound. So if I look at this structure, I think I'll focus on the upper part first. We can see that you can follow the respiratory tract, the lower respiratory tract, all the way from the larynx, calculating the diameter. The largest of the airways is the trachea. It carries the biggest cross-sectional diameter. If I just cut one trachea and I look at its diameter, it ranges to between 15 millimeters to 22 millimeters. So in centimeters, you can talk of about 2 centimeters or slightly larger than 2 centimeters. That's a very big tube. If you go to the bronchi, one of them, it becomes smaller than the trachea, and it is in the range of 10 to 15, which is 1.5 centimeters. Individually, if you take each of them, as you branch further away from the trachea, you're going to come from the bronchioles. If it is one, you call it a bronchus. If there are two, they are bronchi, as it is written here. So we normally have the two primary, because they're the first branching. We talk of the first primary bronchi, there are two of them, okay? And then from there, so you can see the number here. We have one trachea, two primary bronchi. The number of divisions from the trachea is only one. So one trachea will divide once to give two bronchi. Now, as you move further away from the trachea, you branch further and further, and the diameter, the individual diameter becomes smaller and smaller. And this is what you have here. The individual diameter becomes smaller. Now, I want to create a confusion here so that you can look at the cross-sectional area. If I take the individual trachea, the diameter being about 2.5, and I calculate the cross-sectional area here, it will have a specific area. In this case, they are talking of 2.5 centimeters square. Because if you take, you can calculate the area here using the diameter, okay? Is it pi r squared or something? Now, if I break this into two, so we have a smaller bronchi and a smaller bronchi. So the cross-sectional area of one bronchus compared to one trachea will be small. But if I add this area to this one, and I add the two of them and I compare them, you find that it will be slightly bigger. Now take the primary bronchi and divide them further, maybe into small portions like that. They will be tinier than these, but if I take the cross-sectional area of all these, add them up, and remember, the same, because these are primary, this will be secondary. So now I'm adding the secondary cross-sectional area. In this case, I will take all this area at this level, add it up, add this up. Compare the total surface area I'm getting here to the single trachea. So what is happening as I move further away from the trachea to the cross-sectional area? Is it decreasing or increasing?
It's increasing.
It is increasing. That's what I wanted you to note. The cross-sectional area is increasing as you move further away, because it is not for an individual tube. It is for the sum of all tubes which have branched up to that level. This becomes very important because when you start talking of resistance, which area provides the highest resistance? You find because of this cross-sectional area here, it is easier to distribute air to those small pockets than it is for the same amount of air passing within this small cross-sectional area. Imagine you have in this cross-sectional area, as opposed to the 5 mLs distributed to all these areas equally. You find that it will easily pass within these small ones as compared to this. What I mean is, if I have a container, I try to show this with one container. If I have a container and I allow a cross-sectional area of a trachea here, and I have another container with so many holes. But when I add them up, they're the cross-sectional area at the level. You'll see like it's at it's like you have, okay, let me just put it in one dimension here. Instead of trying to do a container, but with so many tiny holes, so many of them. Now, if I put in both containers, I put the same volume of fluid, which one will pass faster? Container B or container A? We are trying to pass the fluid through one big hole versus through many tiny holes. Where will the fluid pass faster, A or B?
A.
B.
There is somebody, how many agree with A? Let me see the A's hands up. One person. The A's, one person. Remember, it's the same volume, one big hole versus very many tiny holes. So, Anastasia.
Yes.
Anastasia, I don't know whether you've done some cookery, you've done some kitchen work, okay? And you have a funnel. If you have a funnel and you're trying to pass fluid in that funnel, versus when you have a sieve has many holes. A funnel has one hole. Where will the fluid pass faster? In the funnel or in the sieve? Now you see where I'm getting at, yeah?
Yeah.
The sieve will have less resistance because the holes are too many. They are spread out, they are too many. It will pass easily there as compared to one main place. So what happens because of this cross-sectional area, it is increasing as you move further away from the trachea. So the resistance there will be less as compared to the one major tract, which is at the tract. Now the importance becomes, if you are to constrict all these holes to make them smaller at the same time, you will have increased the resistance here much more than if you are to try and do it at this large one. If you are to if you are to dilate them at this level, you reduce the resistance further, and it becomes even much more easier for the air to pass through there than in this one. Where am I getting at this? We find that, as you can see here, at the tiniest level, we have some muscles. At the beginning, we have a lot of cartilage. The purpose of the cartilage is to keep the airways open. They must stay open all the time. However, as you branch and you move further away from the trachea, you start to increase the percentage of smooth muscles. Now, smooth muscles can be easily manipulated by drugs or by the neurotransmitters or by hormones. It means you can tell the smooth muscles to contract or to relax. So, for instance, when we have a problem with asthma, usually you have inflammation of these tiny airways and they collapse. And when they end up creating a higher resistance, remember the example I just gave you of the sieve with the many holes. If each of those holes were to become smaller, you are increasing the resistance much, much more than if you are to do it at the trachea. So that is what happens with a person with asthma. You suddenly constrict those tiny airways, and then the person cannot allow the air to reach the alveoli. If you do not act fast enough, the person can actually suffer from respiratory distress, which can lead to death. However, give them an inhaler, and the inhaler goes all the way to the muscles here, causing them to relax at once. And when they relax, the air is open and the person is able to breathe. So it is easier to target the tinier vessels because that's where you can change the resistance very easily. You can increase or decrease. Why? Because of this large cross-sectional area. Are we together on that point?
Yes.
Anybody with a question there? I know that this table is usually difficult to understand. That's why I take a lot of time on it. Remember, the divisions increase, the numbers increase, but also the cross-sectional areas increases. However, as the cross-sectional area increase, the resistance decrease. Okay. So I thought I would finish these slides today. I have one more, but I can skip it to the next time. Because even that one needs more explanation. So I am at this point where I was supposed to explain inside the tissues what is happening here. Remember, I told you it's a spongy tissue. All these are alveoli. You can see the walls between the alveoli. Now, in a case of somebody with alveolar wall damage, you're going to find that this structure becomes continuously smooth. It's like one big balloon. So you do not have these partitions here. And another one you find again is also smooth. You find another one is smooth. Then such a person, you find the cross-section or the area for gaseous exchange is very limited. I think I'll explain these slides further in my next lecture because I need to explain to you what is happening in this slide. And this is my last slide before I go to the next topic. So with that, I will take attendance. Any question I am willing to address as I take attendance. Samuel, Eden can stop